Welcome, gentle listener, to another quiet journey through time. Tonight, we drift softly into the 18th century, an age of powdered wigs, wooden ships, and empires locked in a struggle that would shape the modern world. This is the story of how Britain, against all odds, triumphed over France in the vast and far-reaching 7 Years' War, a conflict fought not just on European soil, but across oceans and continents. As the candlelight flickers and the world grows still, let the noise of history fade into a gentle hum. If these peaceful tales from the past help you find calm or sleep, I'd be so grateful if you desubscribe. There are many more quiet adventures yet to come. Before the cannons thundered and the flags of empire clashed across continents, there was stillness. The kind of stillness that exists only before a storm. Europe in the early 18th century was a landscape of balance, though an uneasy one. Kings, merchants, and ministers all knew that peace was only a polite word for preparation. Beneath the polished surface of diplomacy and trade, the great powers of the age, Britain and France above all, watched one another with the quiet suspicion of neighbours who shared a wall and a history too long to trust. You might imagine yourself walking down a London street in 1740. The air smells faintly of coal smoke and damp wool. Carriages clatter across cobblestones, carrying powdered gentlemen to Parliament, where they debate taxes, trade, and the growing reach of empire. London hums, not with excitement, but with calculation. Ships slip down the Thames every morning, bound for North America, the Caribbean, or the coast of India. Tea, sugar, tobacco, and cotton flow back again, feeding an empire that is still unsure of itself. Across the Channel, Paris moves to a different rhythm. There, the world turns around the court of Louis XV, a kingdom of etiquette and bureaucracy, where the wealth of colonies feels far away and faintly unreal. In the salons, men of letters argue about philosophy and the future of mankind, while in the ministries, tired clerks shuffle through endless ledgers of trade, tariffs, and troop pay. France's colonial empire, though vast, is not as tightly managed as Britain's. Its profits are rich, but fragile, dependent on a web of alliances with indigenous peoples, on fur traders deep in the Canadian wilderness, and on the uncertain winds that carry ships across the Atlantic. In both kingdoms, power rests not only in palaces, but in paper. Every decision, every trade route, every diplomatic promise must be written, sealed, and sent. The world of the 18th century runs on ink as much as iron. The ministers who will one day direct fleets and armies are, for now, simply administrators, men who rise early to read reports and sign decrees, their handwriting shaping the fates of continents. If you were to look closer, though, you would find the same sense of quiet ambition in both nations. Britain's merchants dream of expanding trade into every corner of the globe. France's ministers hope to hold their empire together by grace and by charm. Each imagines itself the rightful master of global commerce, and each quietly suspects the other feels the same. But in 1750, there was still peace, or at least what passed for peace in a century where borders never quite stopped moving. Armies existed more as symbols of power than instruments of destruction. Generals attended the theatre, and naval officers dined with politicians. The wars of the past few decades, the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, had left both nations weary but restless. No one yet knew that another war was already forming, a war that would spread from the forests of North America to the rice fields of India, from the coasts of West Africa to the icy North Sea. For most people, life moved quietly. In the English countryside, farmers tilled rented fields and watched the price of grain rise and fall with the weather. In small French villages, peasants lived as their ancestors had for centuries, tending vineyards, paying taxes, and rarely hearing news from beyond their province. The politics of empire were distant abstractions, spoken of by the local priest, or printed, weeks late, in a newspaper read aloud at the inn. Yet the choices made by kings and ministers in those distant capitals would soon reach them all. The machinery of empire, after all, was built on ordinary lives. The timber for British ships came from slow-growing oaks in rural estates. The iron for French cannon was mined by men who never saw the sea. Colonial ambition depended on the quiet, repetitive labor of thousands who never imagined their work would help ignite a global war. By the mid-18th century, Britain had become something both new and unstable, a financial empire. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, had grown into a mechanism of power as formidable as any army. It allowed wars to be financed through loans rather than taxes, spreading the cost of empire across generations. France, by contrast, still relied on royal credit and the personal favor of its ministers. Its finances were always precarious, a network of promises that could fray under pressure. This difference, though invisible to most, would shape the coming conflict. Britain's system of borrowing allowed it to sustain long wars without collapse. France's reliance on immediate wealth, the income of colonies, the spoils of trade, made it vulnerable when those sources were threatened. In a way, the 7 Years' War began not with muskets, but with ledgers. Meanwhile, on the edges of empire, tensions simmered. In North America, British and French settlers lived side by side along disputed frontiers. They traded, argued, and occasionally fought. Surveyors marked boundaries no one could agree upon. Forts rose quietly in the wilderness, each one a statement of intent. In India, the British and French East India Companies played their own quiet game of rivalry, hiring local soldiers, signing alliances with princes, and extending influence through trade rather than conquest. In Europe itself, the great chessboard of alliances shifted endlessly. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Spain watched Britain and France with careful eyes. Each sought advantage, none trusted the other. The wars of the past had shown how quickly a minor dispute could pull the whole continent into battle. Yet in 1750, few believed another war was near. The diplomats had done their work too well, weaving treaties so intricate that they seemed to bind Europe in peace. But peace built on fear is brittle. Beneath the surface, old rivalries endured. Britain remembered the humiliation of losing Minorca to the French in the earlier wars. France resented Britain's growing dominance at sea. Even among ordinary people, there was a quiet sense of competition, whose ships were faster, whose colonies richer, whose king more powerful. The 18th century was an age obsessed with order. Ministers measured everything: trade flows, grain prices, troop counts, even rainfall. Yet the world they tried to control was far too large, too complex, to fit into their ledgers. The British Empire stretched across oceans. France's influence wound through rivers, forests, and distant coasts. Every colony, every harbour, every fort existed as a potential spark. And so, without anyone intending it, the fuse was already burning. A skirmish here, a diplomatic insult there. Each minor event added tension to a structure that could not hold forever. If you had been alive then, a clerk in London, a merchant in Bordeaux, a soldier stationed in Canada, you might have felt something shifting. Not in the thunder of war, not yet, but in the rhythm of daily life. Ships seemed to sail more often, taxes edged higher, rumours spread a little faster. The balance of peace was tilting, though no one could yet say why. The 7 Years' War, when it came, would not seem like a single conflict at first. It would appear as a collection of local disputes, each small, manageable, and familiar. But together, they would become something new, a truly global war. And so, as Europe drifted through the quiet years of the 1750s, the question lingered like the calm before rain. How long could peace hold when empires dreamed of the same world? While the courts of Europe busied themselves with treaties and correspondence, another world, quieter, slower, but infinitely larger, was already stirring. Across the oceans, in lands far beyond the reach of ministers' maps, empires breathed and grew. The colonies were not the centre of attention, not yet, but their quiet rhythms of trade, travel, and survival were shaping the future in ways no one in London or Paris could yet imagine. If you could drift now across the Atlantic in your mind, the scene would change entirely. The air would be thicker, the colours brighter, the sounds unfamiliar. In the British colonies of North America, towns like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston were bustling, busy places, not yet cities in the modern sense, but lively enough to feel important. Docks groaned with barrels of rum, timber, and tobacco. In the backcountry, settlers pushed slowly westward, felling trees, marking boundaries, and building lives that felt utterly removed from the politeness of European diplomacy. Further north, the French colonies stretched in long, thin lines along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, settlements connected more by river and canoe than by road. Here, life was both harsher and looser. French settlers, fur traders, and missionaries lived among indigenous nations, learning languages, exchanging goods, and forming alliances that were not easily broken. France's empire in America was built less on conquest than on connection. Fragile webs of loyalty that depended on trust, patience, and trade. At first glance, the two empires might have seemed complementary. Britain's colonies, dense and agricultural, hugged the Atlantic coast. France's, sprawling and thinly populated, reached deep into the interior. Between them lay an ocean of forests and rivers, an undefined space that neither empire truly controlled. But in that empty space, quiet conflicts were already unfolding. British farmers wanted more land, fertile ground beyond the Appalachian Mountains. French traders wanted to keep that land open for the fur trade, which relied on unspoiled wilderness and friendly relations with native nations. Both sides built small forts and trading posts. Each insisted they were simply protecting their own territory. The people who lived in those lands, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Mingo, and many others, had their own politics, their own histories. For them, the European presence was both opportunity and threat. Some traded with the British, exchanging pelts for metal tools and cloth. Others sided with the French, who brought gifts and respect, but fewer settlers. In truth, most tried to balance between the two, using the rivalries of distant kings to preserve their own independence. To understand the coming war, you must imagine how slow everything was. Letters took months to cross the ocean. Governors made decisions with information that was already outdated by the time it arrived. Maps were incomplete, drawn from rumour and half-explored rivers. A misunderstanding at a frontier outpost could take half a year to reach London, by which time the situation on the ground might have changed entirely. And yet, despite that slowness, the world was shrinking. Trade had bound continents together. Sugar from the Caribbean, sweetened tea from China, drunk from porcelain made in Europe. Silver from the Americas passed through dozens of hands before ending in the vaults of bankers. The great empires were becoming global organisms, dependent on the steady movement of ships, goods, and people. Every merchant, every sailor, every dock worker was part of that system, even if they never knew it. For Britain, the colonies were both treasure and trouble. They offered wealth, timber, tobacco, fish, and furs, but also endless disputes. Colonists complained about taxes, about governors appointed from afar, about the lack of representation in London, yet they still saw themselves as proudly British. The idea of independence was unthinkable. Loyalty to the crown was woven into everyday speech. France's colonies were smaller in population, but broader in ambition. French officials spoke often of La Nouvelle France as a great arc connecting the Atlantic to the Gulf of Mexico, from Quebec to New Orleans. The vision was beautiful but fragile. The land between, the Ohio Valley, was the key. Whoever controlled that valley could control the entire interior of North America. It was there, in that quiet wilderness of rivers and forests, that the two empires' dreams would collide. Imagine, for a moment, the frontier itself. A trading post by a slow river, its wooden palisade weathered by rain. Inside, barrels of powder, muskets, cloth, and beads. Outside, a mix of languages, English, French, Algonquin, Shawnee. Men and women bartering, laughing, occasionally shouting. At night, the firelight flickers on the faces of men who know they stand at the edge of something vast and uncertain. Few of them thought in terms of empire. They were simply surviving, trading, building, farming, living by instinct and necessity. Yet in their ordinary choices, history was taking shape. A path cut by a trapper might one day mark a boundary line. A fort built by a handful of soldiers might one day provoke a declaration of war. The Atlantic world of the 1750s was restless in subtle ways. Ships left port with greater regularity, carrying soldiers disguised as settlers, weapons hidden among trade goods. Governors began sending cautious reports home, warning that the French were building new forts deep in the contested lands of the Ohio Valley. The French, in turn, complained that British colonists were trespassing on their sovereign territory. Each accusation was half true and half expected. Behind these small disputes lay something deeper, a shift in how power worked. For centuries, Europe had fought over religion, crowns, and dynasties. Now it fought over economics. Trade routes, ports, and colonies mattered more than thrones. A merchant in Bristol could influence the fate of empires through the prices he set on his cargoes. A French ship lost to a storm might ruin a season's profit and alter a minister's decision in Versailles. This new kind of war, commercial, logistical, bureaucratic, was invisible until it erupted. And in the 1750s, it was already rumbling quietly beneath the surface. Still, most people were unaware. In Boston, carpenters built new houses. In Quebec, priests recorded baptisms in neat handwriting. In Calcutta, clerks for the British East India Company copied shipping manifests by candlelight. All across the world, ordinary routines continued, unaware that those same routines were fueling the friction between empires. If the ministers in London or Paris had looked more closely at their maps, they might have sensed what was coming. But the maps were deceiving. The world looked calm in ink, borders clear, territories named. It gave the illusion of control. Yet beyond the neat lines lay millions of square miles of unknown, ungoverned land, and the will of people who did not recognize those lines at all. The colonial world was awakening, not in noise or rebellion, but in quiet significance. Every trade agreement, every frontier post, every river charted, brought the empires closer to collision. And far from Europe, on a humid morning in the Ohio Valley, a group of men would soon meet by a small river. One of them was young, ambitious, and British. His name, George Washington. He did not yet know it, but his actions would ignite a war that stretched across the world. The wind rustles through the trees, the air heavy with summer rain. A small misunderstanding is about to set history in motion. How much of the world, you might wonder, begins by accident? The wilderness of North America in the mid-18th century was a place of silence and immensity. Endless forests, glimmering rivers, and long stretches of land where no European flag had yet taken hold. To those who lived there, the Iroquois, Shawnee, Delaware, and countless others, it was home, sacred and familiar. To those who came from across the sea, it was something else entirely, a prize, a promise, a frontier to be measured and claimed. It was in this quiet landscape that a single misjudgment by a young man barely 22 years old would light a fuse that no one could extinguish. His name was George Washington, and though history would later cast him in marble and myth, in 1754 he was simply a provincial officer, nervous, determined, and far from home. Washington had been sent into the Ohio Valley by Governor Robert Dinwiddie of Virginia, a man more concerned with land titles and profits than with global politics. The British Crown had granted the Ohio Company, a group of well-connected investors, permission to expand westward. France, however, claimed the same lands as part of its vast North American domain. To both empires, this wilderness seemed empty, though in truth, it was alive with communities who had lived there for centuries. Washington's mission was simple in words, but impossible in practice. To deliver a letter to the French commander at Fort Le Boeuf, demanding that his troops withdraw from what Britain considered its territory. In January 1754, with a small party of frontiersmen and native guides, Washington set out from Williamsburg through snow and forest. He kept a journal, part report, part diary, recording each day's hardships with a matter-of-fact calm that would later define his character. The journey was slow, rivers were frozen, trails uncertain. At night, the men slept by their fires, wrapped in wet blankets. Washington, still inexperienced, learned the patience that frontier life demanded. When he finally reached the French post, the commandant received him politely, offered wine, read the British letter, and replied, in essence, that France had no intention of leaving. The conversation was formal, courteous, and utterly futile. Washington returned to Virginia with the answer everyone expected. What no one yet realized was that the polite exchange of letters had already given way to something more dangerous. In the spring, as the forests thawed, both sides began to act. France sent soldiers southward from Canada to build new forts along the Ohio River, strengthening their hold on the region. British settlers and militiamen, hearing rumors of these movements, began to organize their own defenses. Suspicion grew like underbrush after rain, quietly, invisibly, until it filled the landscape. Governor Dinwiddie, anxious not to lose ground, sent Washington back, this time with orders not to talk, but to build. He was to construct a fort at the forks of the Ohio, where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers met, a strategic point that would one day become Pittsburgh. Washington led about 160 men, a mixture of Virginia militiamen and laborers, through difficult country. But by the time they arrived, French troops had already taken the site and begun building their own fortress, Fort Duquesne. It was a moment of quiet humiliation. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Washington retreated several miles south and hastily constructed a smaller stockade, Fort Necessity, in a meadow surrounded by forest. The name, chosen with irony, proved prophetic. It was here, in the damp summer of 1754, that the first shots of a global war were fired. One morning in late May, Washington received word from his native allies, led by a Seneca chief known to the British as Half King, that a small French detachment was camped nearby. The French, it was said, had been sent to scout or perhaps to deliver a message. Their intentions were unclear. Acting on instinct and a sense of duty, Washington led a surprise attack through the woods. The skirmish that followed lasted only 15 minutes. Muskets cracked, smoke drifted among the trees, and when it was over, 10 French soldiers were dead, including their commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. The rest were captured. Washington's men suffered only one fatality. It seemed at first a minor victory, a successful ambush in a remote forest, but history rarely announces its turning points. Jumonville, it turned out, had been carrying diplomatic papers. He was not a raider or a spy, but an emissary, a messenger of peace. His death was, from the French point of view, murder. Washington, though he did not yet know it, had effectively declared war. The aftermath was awkward and uncertain. Washington's reports described the skirmish as an act of self-defense. His native allies, however, viewed it differently, as a statement of hostility. Half King is said to have struck the dying Jumonville with a hatchet, declaring that the French would now know his resolve. Whether this detail is true or embellished by later retellings, it captures the tension of that morning, the collision of worlds, each following its own code. Washington withdrew to Fort Necessity, aware that French retaliation was inevitable. Rain fell for days, turning the meadow into mud. His men, poorly supplied and inexperienced, dug shallow trenches and waited. On July 3rd, a combined force of French soldiers and indigenous allies, nearly twice Washington's number, surrounded the fort. The battle was long and miserable. Rain soaked the gunpowder, muskets misfired, and confusion reigned. Inside the fort, wounded men groaned in the mud. By nightfall, Washington accepted the inevitable. He agreed to surrender, the only time in his life he would do so. The terms, written in French, included a word that would haunt him: assassinat, assassination, a reference to Jumonville's death. Washington, not fluent in the language, signed without realizing its full implication. The next morning, the British marched out, leaving their wounded behind. The French allowed them to return home under parole. The fort, soaked and silent, was abandoned to the wilderness. Thus ended the first engagement of the 7 Years' War, though few recognized it as such. To the British press, it was a small colonial setback. To the French court, it was an insult demanding response. Across Europe, the incident appeared in dispatches and diplomatic letters, each version slightly different, each more alarming than the last. The chain of consequences had begun, slow at first, then unstoppable. Washington himself returned to Virginia subdued but unbroken. His superiors praised his courage, minimized his mistakes, and quietly prepared for the next campaign. The young officer had learned something that would stay with him for life: that glory and disaster are often separated by little more than weather and translation. In the forests of the Ohio Valley, the rain eventually stopped. Grass grew over the trenches of Fort Necessity. The birds returned. For the land itself, the war had barely begun, but for the empires across the sea, the ripples of that muddy skirmish were already spreading. Through ministerial reports, through secret letters, through the quiet corridors of power, where men in wigs debated matters they barely understood. It is easy, looking back, to see inevitability where there was only confusion. No one in that meadow believed they had started a world war. They thought only of survival, of getting through another day of rain, of finding food, of returning home. Yet from that forgotten valley, the world would soon burn from Canada to Bengal. It began with a letter, delivered too late. It continued with a misunderstanding, written too hastily. And it ended with nations at war across the globe. History often turns not on grand speeches, but on small mistakes. You might wonder then, if Washington had waited one more day, if the rain had fallen sooner, if the letter had arrived earlier, would the world have changed at all? When the last embers of Fort Necessity cooled in the rain, the forest returned to quiet. The birds came back. The river carried away the ashes. But across the Atlantic, in the drawing rooms and ministries of Europe, that quiet was replaced by something else: a slow, uncertain unease. News in the 18th century moved at the pace of wind and water. It took weeks for a letter to cross the ocean, and weeks more for it to be read, copied, and replied to. The events of July 1754 would not reach London and Paris until late autumn, and even then, they arrived not as clear reports, but as bundles of conflicting accounts: soldiers' diaries, traders' rumours, captains' letters, all written in different tones, each uncertain of the truth. Imagine a dim office in Whitehall. The fire is low, the air thick with tobacco smoke and candle wax. A clerk, hunched over his desk, opens a packet from Virginia. The ink has run where rain touched the paper. He smooths it out and begins to read. The handwriting is steady, precise, and heavy with apology. The report describes a skirmish in the Ohio Valley, a misunderstanding with the French, and a temporary retreat. Nothing dramatic, nothing that sounds like war. The clerk nods, writes a summary, and passes it along to a superior, who adds it to a growing stack of colonial correspondence. It may be days before anyone reads it again. In London, as in Paris, information was always arriving, and never quite enough. At first, the incident is treated as a local matter, another colonial tangle between overzealous governors and rival traders. France, however, reads the same reports differently. In Versailles, ministers of the Conseil du Roi are alarmed. Jumonville's death is described as an assassinate, an act of deliberate aggression. The French foreign minister, the Marquis de Puisieux, orders an investigation. Letters are sent to London demanding an explanation. But diplomacy in the 1750s was a game of patience and paperwork. Each message required translation, copying, approval, and reply. It took 6 months for an exchange of letters that could have been settled in an hour by conversation. By the time London's polite denials reached Paris, the frontier in America had already changed again. In those same months, France continued to build forts along the Ohio and Great Lakes, while Britain began quietly reinforcing its own colonies. Both governments pretended that peace remained, yet both were preparing for war. The ministers who managed these affairs were not soldiers. They were accountants, secretaries, and nobles of quiet ambition. They worked long hours in rooms lined with books and maps, under portraits of monarchs who rarely noticed them. Their language was cautious, their handwriting neat, their tempers controlled. They believed, perhaps sincerely, that through careful administration, war could be avoided. But behind them, the machinery of empire kept moving. Ships were built, supplies were ordered, new regiments were raised for defensive purposes. In every port, the smell of tar and timber thickened the air. In London, the British cabinet was divided. The Duke of Newcastle, a man of energy, but little clarity, managed foreign affairs with nervous precision. His letters were long, his decisions delayed. "We must act firmly," he wrote, "but not rashly. We must show strength, but avoid provocation." Around him, subordinates nodded and drafted memoranda that said the same thing in more words. Across the Channel, the French Foreign Office held the same debates in reverse. Some ministers argued for patience, for diplomacy and delay. Others insisted that British aggression must be punished to preserve national honour. The King, Louis XV, listened politely, said little, and signed what was put before him. In both nations, the bureaucrats believed they were managing a crisis. In truth, they were watching it drift beyond their control. As the paper moved, so did the ships. French convoys sailed from Brest and Rochefort, officially carrying supplies for peaceful trade. British squadrons, dispatched to ensure maritime safety, shadowed them at a distance. In Caribbean waters, captains traded warnings and rumours, each certain that the other had orders to strike first. In the spring of 1755, the illusion of peace began to crack. The British Navy seized several French merchant ships in the Atlantic, arguing that they carried military cargo. France protested. Britain replied with silence. Newspapers printed cautious reports. Tensions in the colonies, an affair in the Ohio. Most readers turned the page. Yet beneath the quiet, Europe was beginning to stir. Armies were being recalled to readiness. Recruitment notices appeared on tavern doors. Artillery officers began inspecting fortresses long left neglected. Still, there was no declaration, no announcement, just the slow turning of gears. In Parliament, debates stretched on for hours. Members argued over trade monopolies, over the cost of defence, over whether the colonies were worth the trouble. Some claimed the Americans were restless and disloyal. Others dismissed such talk as nonsense. "These small wars," one member remarked, "cost more in paper than in blood." Few realized how prophetic that would sound later. Meanwhile, in the colonies, events continued without waiting for instructions. British and French outposts clashed along the frontier. Prisoners were exchanged, then captured again. Native nations, watching closely, began to choose sides. The French offered gifts and respect. The British offered goods and promises. Both offered more than they could deliver. By early 1756, the situation could no longer be ignored. Reports from America grew urgent. Forts had fallen. Skirmishes had turned into battles. Merchants complained of interrupted trade. Admirals demanded clearer orders. The cabinets of Europe, once slow and methodical, now found themselves overwhelmed. At last, formal declarations were drafted, but even these moved slowly. Each word had to be weighed, each phrase translated. In London, the final document passed through 7 hands before being signed. It reached the French court weeks after French troops had already begun seizing British ships. The delay was almost comic, if it hadn't been so costly. Thus, what history calls the 7 Years' War officially began, though by the time it was declared, it had already been fought for 2 years. In hindsight, it is easy to see the absurdity of it all. Thousands of lives suspended between letters and signatures, the pace of bureaucracy hopelessly out of step with the pace of events. But at the time, it seemed inevitable, the natural rhythm of empire. where decisions were made not by passion, but by paper. Even as the First Fleet set sail, the clerks continued to write. Reports were copied in triplicate, sealed, and filed. Ministers reassured one another that the war would be brief and containable. It would not. Still, for a moment, the world remained calm. The news had not yet reached every village. The bells of Paris and London still rang for weddings and markets. In the great cities of Europe, people slept under the illusion of peace, unaware that by morning, ships would be meeting in the Atlantic, and soldiers would be marching under unfamiliar skies. The bureaucrats had done their part, slowly, cautiously, and too late. Now, the war belonged to the sea, and as the sails filled with wind, the question lingered in every admiral's mind. Could paper and pen still control what cannon and tide would soon decide? When war finally arrived, it did so with more confusion than ceremony. There were no ringing declarations in the squares of Paris or London, no parades to mark the beginning of a grand struggle. Instead, the world simply drifted into conflict. One ship seized here, a fort attacked there, and then suddenly, the map of the world seemed to tremble. The French were first to act with clarity. By early 1756, they understood that delay would only favour Britain's navy. France, smaller in ships but rich in skilled commanders, sought to strike quickly where Britain was least ready, in the Mediterranean, in Minorca, and across the forests of North America. It began, appropriately, with an island. Minorca, a small rocky outpost in the western Mediterranean, had long been a British possession. Its harbour at Mahon was deep and defensible, a prize station between Gibraltar and Italy. Yet by 1756, its defences were neglected, its garrison thin. The men stationed there had not seen combat in years. Their uniforms were faded, their muskets outdated. In April of that year, a French fleet under the command of the Duke of Richelieu, a man as elegant as he was ambitious, set sail from Toulon. His orders were simple: capture the island before the British could react. The British response was sluggish. Admiral John Byng, a cautious and somewhat uninspired officer, was dispatched from Portsmouth with a small fleet. His instructions were vague: protect Minorca if possible, but avoid unnecessary risk. It was the sort of order that could ruin a man. By the time Byng reached the Mediterranean, Richelieu's troops had already landed on Minorca and laid siege to Fort St. Philip. The British garrison, under General Blakeney, held out behind its crumbling walls, short on food and water. The summer sun scorched the limestone, and disease spread faster than courage. When Byng finally approached the island in May, he found the French fleet waiting. The two squadrons clashed in a confused and indecisive battle. Not a grand engagement, but a long exchange of cannon fire that left both sides battered and uncertain. Byng, unwilling to risk his ships further, withdrew to Gibraltar for repairs. It was a prudent move, perhaps, but one that would cost him his life. In London, the news was received with outrage. The government, already unpopular, needed a scapegoat. Byng, who had failed to do his utmost, was arrested, court-martialed, and condemned. He was executed by firing squad on the deck of his own ship in March 1757, a grim message to every officer in the service. Hesitation would not be forgiven. Voltaire would later remark, with his usual dry wit, that the English shoot an admiral from time to encourage the others. Minorca fell. France celebrated. The first blow of the war had landed squarely in their favour. But while the Mediterranean turned quiet again, the forests of North America grew restless. In Canada, the Marquis de Montcalm had arrived to take command of French forces. He was a professional soldier, educated, disciplined, and polite, but he found himself in a world that obeyed none of Europe's rules. The land was vast, the roads poor, and the alliances fragile. The French held a chain of forts stretching from the St. Lawrence River to the Mississippi, but they were thinly manned and scattered across wilderness. Montcalm understood the importance of the native alliances that had long sustained French power in North America. The Huron, Abenaki, and Algonquin nations were not mere auxiliaries. They were partners, each with their own politics and grievances. Montcalm, unlike many of his British counterparts, treated them with respect, though not always with understanding. His first major challenge came at Oswego, a British fort on the southern shore of Lake Ontario. The fort was a symbol of British expansion into territory the French considered their own. In the summer of 1756, Montcalm marched against it with a mixed force of French regulars, Canadian militia, and native warriors. The siege was short but decisive. The British commander, Colonel Mercer, was killed by cannon fire, and the fort surrendered after only a few days. The French took over 1,400 prisoners and seized valuable supplies, including dozens of cannon and thousands of muskets. In London, the loss of Oswego caused alarm. It revealed what many had long suspected. Britain's North American defences were poorly coordinated, divided among competing colonial governments and uncertain commanders. Meanwhile, France was celebrating again. The victory at Oswego confirmed Montcalm's reputation and strengthened French control over the Great Lakes. More importantly, it gave the illusion, for a time, that France was winning the war. Across the Atlantic, the situation looked equally favourable for France. Their fleets had avoided destruction. Their armies were advancing in the colonies. Their allies, notably Austria and Russia, were drawing Britain's partner, Prussia, into costly continental battles. Britain, by contrast, seemed directionless. The Duke of Newcastle's government wavered between caution and confusion. Troops were sent to Europe and then recalled. Supplies were ordered and then delayed. The empire seemed vast but brittle. Too many fronts, too few plans. In the taverns of London, men debated whether the war was already lost. Pamphlets accused ministers of cowardice and incompetence. The newspapers, often days late with their news, printed maps with arrows pointing nowhere. And yet, amid the gloom, there were voices of quiet confidence. A few naval officers believed that if Britain could seize control of the sea, everything else would follow. Others argued that the colonies, if properly defended and supplied, could outlast France by sheer endurance. But in 1756 and 1757, those were still dreams. The reality was grim. French forces continued to strike across the frontier, burning settlements and seizing forts. British colonists fled eastward, abandoning farms and villages to the wilderness. The war that had begun as a distant quarrel between empires was now felt in every home from New England to Nova Scotia. Merchants lost their ships, farmers their harvests, families their safety. The frontier, once a line on a map, had become a landscape of fear. And still, in Europe, the politicians spoke of patience, of negotiation, of peace in due time. Letters continued to cross the Atlantic, carrying orders that would arrive months too late. In the quiet moments between battles, Montcalm wrote to his wife in France. His letters were tender, full of longing for home. "This country is vast," he wrote, "and its beauty severe. I feel I am at the end of the world." He was right, and he was only at the beginning of a war that would consume continents. For now, the French had the advantage. Their armies had won, their admirals had struck, and their enemies seemed to stumble. The winds of fortune were theirs. But as history often reminds us, winds change. And somewhere, in the crowded chambers of Westminster, a new voice was beginning to rise. One that would change Britain's fortunes forever. In the spring of 1757, as Britain's fortunes seemed to crumble, the streets of London were heavy with discontent. The news from abroad was a litany of loss. Minorca fallen, Oswego gone, the colonies in retreat. In the coffeehouses near the Strand, men read the latest dispatches with shaking heads. The empire that had once seemed unshakable was adrift, its leaders uncertain, its purpose unclear. And yet, amid the fog of failure, a new figure was emerging, one whose voice carried through Parliament like a command from the very heart of the empire. His name was William Pitt, known already as the Great Commoner. Pitt was not a nobleman nor a soldier. He had no title, no great estate, no family dynasty to protect him. What he possessed instead was something rarer: conviction, vision, and an unrelenting belief that Britain's destiny lay not in Europe, but across the oceans. When he spoke, he did so with a mixture of eloquence and fury. His sentences were long, his tone deliberate, his passion unmistakable. He accused ministers of cowardice, of incompetence, of wasting the blood and treasure of the nation. He demanded reform, strategy, and unity, and perhaps most importantly, clarity. The war, he said, is not to be fought in the petty courts of Europe, but upon the seas and in the colonies. There lies the heart of our power. At first, few listened. The Duke of Newcastle and his circle of aging politicians treated Pitt as a nuisance, a man too loud, too opinionated, and too dangerous. But the public adored him. Crowds gathered to hear his speeches. Pamphlets circulated his words. When the government tried to silence him, his popularity only grew. By the summer of 1757, even the king, who disliked him personally, was forced to recognize his necessity. Britain needed a voice strong enough to rally it from despair, and so, reluctantly, William Pitt was appointed Secretary of State, effectively the war's director. He entered office not as a man of compromise, but as a man with a plan. His first order of business was to restore confidence. The Navy, he said, must become the Empire's sword and shield. Every ship capable of sailing was to be repaired, manned, and armed. Shipyards across England came alive again with the sound of hammers, saws, and shouted orders. The smell of tar and salt filled the air. Pitt also recognized that Britain's colonies, scattered and poorly coordinated, needed leadership. He replaced indecisive governors with men of energy and purpose. He sent new commanders to America, not aristocrats seeking glory, but professionals who understood endurance. Among them were Geoffrey Amherst, calm and methodical, and James Wolfe, young, daring, and brilliant. In Parliament, Pitt argued that the war must be fought as a global enterprise. The French, he reasoned, could not be defeated solely in Europe. The key was to strike at their empire, their colonies, their ports, their trade. Britain's strength was not in armies, but in ships, and on ships the world could be reached. And so the plan for victory began to take shape. Step by step, Pitt restructured the Empire's war effort into something coherent. Troops were raised through voluntary enlistment, not forced conscription. Supplies were purchased fairly, paid for promptly, a small miracle in wartime. He worked tirelessly, dictating letters deep into the night, his desk lit by candlelight and scattered with maps of the world. He could not control everything, and he knew it, but he could create momentum. In 1757, British fleets began to move again. Squadrons were dispatched to the West Indies, to Africa, and to the coast of India. Each was ordered not to defend, but to seize. The goal was no longer to contain France, but to break its empire, piece by piece. At home, Pitt also made a political alliance with the man he had once despised, the Duke of Newcastle. Newcastle's vast network of influence and Pitt's fierce leadership formed an unlikely but effective partnership. One managed through mutual suspicion and necessity. Pitt directed strategy, Newcastle managed Parliament. Together, they kept the machinery of government from collapsing. Meanwhile, across Europe, the war expanded. Prussia, Britain's ally, was fighting for survival against Austria, Russia, and France. Frederick the Great, the Prussian king, was locked in battles that devoured entire armies. Pitt saw Frederick as a valuable distraction, a shield that kept France occupied on the continent while Britain struck overseas. It was a cold calculation, but an effective one. By 1758, Pitt's vision was beginning to show results. The Royal Navy, now fully mobilized, dominated the seas. Convoys moved with discipline, escorts kept order, and privateers, those semi-legal predators of commerce, struck fear into French merchants. In the American colonies, the British war effort was finally unified. Pitt had promised the colonial assemblies that London would pay for troops and supplies if they raised men locally. The response was overwhelming. By summer, tens of thousands of provincial soldiers were under arms, marching alongside regular British regiments. For the first time, Britain and its colonies were fighting as one. Morale changed too. The sense of helplessness that had shadowed the empire began to lift. Newspapers reported victories, small at first, but meaningful. Forts captured, ships taken, trade restored. Still, Pitt knew that success would not come quickly. He once wrote, in a moment of private reflection, "This war is not one of glory, but of endurance. The slow and steady application of power will wear the enemy down more surely than any triumph of a single day." And he was right. The year 1758 would see Britain's fortune begin to turn, not in a single battle, but through a series of steady, relentless efforts. Across the oceans, the empire was beginning to awaken, to stretch its reach, to remember its strength. But in the early months of his leadership, Pitt also faced deep resistance. The king mistrusted him, the aristocracy resented him, and the treasury groaned under the cost of his ambitions. Every plan required gold, and gold was running short. Yet Pitt refused to waver. "If we must borrow," he said, "let us borrow for victory." That year, the government borrowed millions, not for luxuries, but for logistics, food for soldiers, powder for cannon, timber for ships. The war was expensive, but efficiency replaced waste. And with every ship that sailed, Britain's presence grew. In Portsmouth, an admiral watched his fleet prepare to depart and said quietly, "The tide turns with the wind, and with Pitt." He was not wrong. The tide was indeed turning. The colonies were stirring with renewed hope. France, though still confident, was beginning to feel the strain of overextension. Its treasury was thinning. Its fleets were spread thin. Its commanders were stretched across 3 continents. For the first time since the war began, the British had direction, and that direction pointed toward victory, though few yet dared to speak the word aloud. As winter settled over Europe, Pitt's ministers prepared new campaigns. Maps were drawn, fleets assembled, letters sent across the sea. The next year would bring boldness and blood. For in 1758, Britain would test Pitt's grand design on the world stage, from the shores of Canada to the jungles of India. But as the candle burned low on his desk, Pitt paused, quill in hand, staring at a map that stretched from London to Quebec to Calcutta. He had given Britain a plan. Now he wondered, could it be enough to save an empire built on distance, pride, and paper? By the dawn of 1758, the war had become truly global. What began as a quarrel in the forests of North America had stretched itself across oceans, creeping into harbours, colonies, and trading posts that most Britons had never heard of. The map of the world, already marked with imperial colours, now blurred at its edges. Everywhere, sails moved like silent shadows. You might imagine Britain's warships scattered across a vast blue canvas. Some were old and heavy, their timbers creaking with every swell. Others were new and sleek, products of Pitt's determination and the labour of countless shipwrights. Together, they formed a web that spanned the seas, from the Caribbean's hot winds to the cold currents off Newfoundland, from the coast of Africa to the far shores of India. This was not a war fought in a single line, but in thousands of small points of contact, ports, rivers, coves, and forts. The victories were rarely grand, but they accumulated quietly, like the turning of the tide. The first blows came in the Atlantic. British squadrons, commanded by admirals with names little remembered now, Boscawen, Pocock, Osborne, began to seize French merchant convoys one after another. The sea lanes that once fed France's empire became narrow corridors of fear. Insurance rates soared. Merchants refused to sail. French ports filled with idle ships, their sails furled and their crews unpaid. Each captured vessel brought not just cargo, but intelligence, maps, letters, naval orders. Bit by bit, the Royal Navy learned the rhythms of its enemy until France's movements at sea were no longer secret. In the Caribbean, the climate itself was an enemy. The sun burned through canvas. The air was thick with salt and sickness. Yellow fever stalked the decks, taking more men than cannon ever could. Yet still the ships came, chasing French privateers who darted from island to island. The island of Martinique, rich in sugar and guarded by coral reefs, was attacked first. The British landing failed. Heat, disease, and French cannon fire drove them back. But Pitt's plan was not built on a single stroke. It was built on persistence. The next target was Guadeloupe, another jewel of the French Caribbean. There, British forces under General John Barrington fought through sweltering jungles and choking humidity, enduring fever and hunger. After 3 months, the French governor surrendered. It was not a grand victory, but it was proof that the empire could take and hold what it set its mind to. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the war in North America entered a new phase. Reinforced by Pitt's reforms, the British launched 3 coordinated campaigns. Their goal: to strike at the heart of New France and dismantle the network of forts that bound it together. The first campaign, under General Amherst, aimed for Louisbourg, the fortress that guarded the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. Louisbourg was more than a military base. It was the gateway to Quebec, the key to Canada itself. The siege began in early June. The British fleet, hundreds of sails strong, appeared off the coast of Cape Breton Island like a pale wall against the sea. The French defenders, outnumbered and undersupplied, fought bravely. For 7 long weeks, cannon thundered day and night. The ground shook, and the air filled with smoke and salt. Inside the fortress, rations dwindled. The garrison, hungry and exhausted, began to crumble. By late July, the French commander, the Chevalier de Drucourt, surrendered. Louisbourg fell. For the first time, the path to the St. Lawrence lay open. The victory electrified London. Church bells rang for days. The newspapers printed maps of Canada, their margins filled with cautious pride. Even those who had once doubted Pitt now began to believe in his vision. Yet the war was not confined to the Atlantic world. Thousands of miles away in India, another struggle unfolded. The British East India Company, a trading corporation turned private army, was locked in conflict with French forces and their allies. The French, led by the skilled and pragmatic Comte de Lally, sought to reclaim lost ground. But the British commander, Robert Clive, understood the war as both military and political. He forged alliances with Indian rulers, used gold where cannon failed, and built a network of influence that slowly strangled French power on the subcontinent. The Battle of Cuddalore, the skirmishes at Wandiwash, these names rarely echo in memory, yet they were decisive in shaping the fate of empire. Every village won, every fort captured, was another thread added to Britain's expanding dominion. Even in Africa, the shadow of the war fell. British ships struck at Gorée, a small but strategic French post on the coast of Senegal. The fort surrendered quickly. Another flag changed hands. It was not glory that drove these campaigns. Not really. It was logistics, persistence, paperwork. Thousands of clerks, sailors, and soldiers performed their duties without ever seeing the larger design. A victory in the Caribbean meant more sugar for trade. A fortress in India meant a foothold for commerce. A naval blockade meant hunger in France. Slowly, the pattern became visible. Pitt's strategy, that boring war of endurance, as he once called it, was working. France, overstretched and underfunded, was beginning to falter. The cost of maintaining armies in Europe and fleets overseas was crushing. The colonies that had once made her rich were now liabilities, targets too distant to defend. Yet, even in success, the war remained exhausting. Men died not in glorious battle, but of disease, hunger, and storms. Ships sank quietly, taking entire crews with them into the cold dark. For every victory reported in London, there were a dozen small tragedies that never reached the papers. By the end of 1758, Britain's red ensigns flew over new territories across the globe. The empire had begun to shift from defense to dominance. But in North America, one final obstacle remained: the beating heart of French power in the New World, Quebec. And so, as the year turned and the fleets returned to Winter Harbour, Pitt and his generals began to prepare for the next great campaign, the conquest of Canada, the decisive blow. But as they studied their maps and wrote their orders, one question lingered quietly among them. Could Britain's vast, fragile success survive the strain of victory itself? The winter of 1758 settled over Britain like a pause between heartbeats. The bells that had rung for Louisbourg grew quiet, the headlines faded, and yet, beneath the calm, every corridor of power was alive with planning. The war was not finished, not yet. The next move would be the greatest of all and the most uncertain. The objective was simple to state, but difficult to reach: Quebec. Perched high upon its cliffs above the St. Lawrence River, Quebec was the nerve center of New France. From it, messages, trade, and orders flowed like blood through an artery. Take Quebec, and French power in North America would collapse. Fail, and years of effort and lives would be lost to the wind. In a quiet room in London, William Pitt leaned over a large map spread across his desk. Candles flickered at its edges, their wax staining the paper. The St. Lawrence River curved like a silver thread, twisting through forests and unknown distances. There were few details, only the names of rivers and towns copied from outdated charts. But to Pitt's mind, this was where Britain's fate would turn. He traced the river with his finger and whispered, almost to himself, "This is the road to victory." The planning began with logistics, the dull, endless arithmetic of empire. Ships had to be built, regiments raised, supplies gathered, and officers appointed. Each order travelled through layers of bureaucracy, each decision delayed by the slowness of communication. Even as the ships were being prepared in Portsmouth and Chatham, ice still locked the rivers of Canada. There would be no movement until spring. Pitt's choice of commanders revealed his growing confidence in new men. The overall command of the expedition went to Major General Geoffrey Amherst, the calm strategist who had taken Louisbourg. Under him, a younger officer would lead the main assault, James Wolfe, only 32 years old. Wolfe was an unusual soldier. Tall, thin, and pale, he looked more scholar than warrior. His manner was awkward, his health fragile, but his energy was unrelenting. At Louisbourg, he had proven his courage and his brilliance in the chaos of siege warfare. Pitt saw in him the kind of leader who could act boldly when others hesitated. Wolfe himself was less certain. In a letter to his mother, he confessed, "I am in a state of health and temper ill-suited to the business I am entrusted with." But he accepted the command nonetheless. He knew the task would not be easy, and perhaps that was what drew him to it. Through the winter, Wolfe studied reports and maps, though most were unreliable. No one in Britain had seen Quebec in decades. Some described it as impregnable, a fortress carved from the cliffside. Others said its walls were weak and its people starving. Between these extremes lay the truth, a city both strong and vulnerable, depending on how one approached it. Meanwhile, in Canada, the Marquis de Montcalm prepared for the inevitable. He too had spent the winter planning, though with far fewer resources. His troops were exhausted, his supplies dwindling, and his allies restless. Still, Montcalm had one great advantage: the terrain itself. The cliffs of Quebec were natural defences, and the narrow river approach could be easily guarded. He did not know when the British would come, only that they would. The spring thaw of 1759 brought with it the hum of movement. In British shipyards, sails were hoisted, and hulls creaked as they met the water for the first time. Convoys assembled, transports, frigates, supply ships, and men of war, a fleet of hundreds, bound for the unknown. For the soldiers, the journey itself was an ordeal. Weeks at sea, cramped below deck, the air thick with damp and smoke. Rats nested in the stores, and sickness spread through the ranks. The meals were hard biscuits and salted meat, softened with brine. Yet the men endured, carried forward by discipline and the promise of something greater. When the fleet finally gathered at Halifax, in Nova Scotia, it was one of the largest ever seen in North America. Over 200 ships, carrying nearly 9,000 soldiers, supplies, and cannon. Admiral Charles Saunders commanded the naval forces, a patient, precise officer whose calm would prove invaluable. At Halifax, the plan was reviewed again and again. Every possible landing site was considered, every obstacle debated. Wolfe, despite his youth, was restless. He wanted to move quickly, to strike hard before the French could prepare. Amherst, cautious as ever, urged patience. The weather, however, made the decision for them. Fog and storm delayed their departure for weeks. When at last the fleet sailed in late June, it was like a floating city, a long procession of masts stretching across the horizon. The sound of drums and the cries of sailors echoed over the water. As the ships entered the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the challenges multiplied. The river was treacherous, filled with shifting sandbanks and narrow channels. Pilots who knew the route were few, and some refused to sail at all. The navigation charts were crude, based more on rumour than science. To guide the fleet, the British relied on local knowledge, fishermen, traders, and even deserters from French service. Each bend in the river was a test of nerve and faith. At night, lanterns flickered on the decks, casting trembling light across the black water. The wind carried the smell of pine and smoke from distant shores. By late June, the fleet reached the Île d'Orléans, just downstream from Quebec. From there, the soldiers could see the city for the first time, rising like a fortress from the cliffs, its church spires catching the morning sun. Between them and the city lay the St. Lawrence River, wide and swift, and the French batteries that lined its banks. Wolfe stood on the deck of his flagship, the Sutherland, and gazed at the distant walls. He said nothing for a long time. Then, turning to an aide, he murmured, "We will have to climb the heights or die beneath them." It was not bravado. It was prophecy. The army went ashore on the Île d'Orléans and began to build camp. The fields were wet and uneven, and the nights were cold even in summer. From the far shore, French cannon began to fire intermittently, their smoke drifting over the river. The siege of Quebec had begun, not with a charge, but with the slow, deliberate work of positioning, mapping, and waiting. Over the following weeks, Wolfe's forces searched for weaknesses. They probed the shoreline, sent small detachments upriver and down, looking for any point where the cliffs might be climbed. Each skirmish was a reminder of how precarious the operation truly was. Supplies dwindled. Men grew sick from exposure and fatigue. In his journal, Wolfe recorded the strain. "This country and this campaign will try every constitution. There is no comfort, no respite, and no certain prospect." Back in London, Pitt received only fragments of information. Weeks old, often contradictory. He waited for word in silence, pacing his study, his plans balanced between triumph and disaster. For now, the great assault remained in preparation. A vast, uneasy machine, gathering momentum in the mists of the St. Lawrence. Both commanders, Wolfe and Montcalm, knew that the coming months would decide not only the fate of Quebec, but the shape of an entire continent. And as the summer sun rose over the river, one question hung between them like the echo of a cannon not yet fired. When the storm finally broke, who would be left standing on the heights? The siege of Quebec began not with a thunderclap, but with the slow creak of ropes and the steady rhythm of shovels in the dirt. The British army had arrived, but victory remained distant, hidden behind the cliffs, the river, and the patient defences of New France. By early July, Wolfe's forces had spread across the Île d'Orléans and the opposite shore at Point Lévis, their red coats bright against the green fields and pale river mist. From there, they began the grim, methodical work of constructing batteries. Lines of cannon pointed toward Quebec's walls. Each cannon was dragged into position by teams of sweating men and horses, the ground trembling under the weight. The French, watching from the heights, answered with their own artillery. The exchange began as a kind of daily ritual, the dull boom of guns echoing across the St. Lawrence, followed by long silences broken only by the wind. Smoke drifted over the river like low clouds. Inside Quebec, life continued under siege. The city's stone houses shook with every impact, and families huddled in cellars while the bells of the cathedral rang amid the gunfire. Montcalm moved among the people, calm and dignified, encouraging them to endure. His soldiers, regulars and militia alike, dug trenches, repaired earthworks, and manned the walls day and night. Food was already scarce. The previous winter had been harsh, and the countryside around the city could no longer support them. Every loaf of bread, every barrel of salt meat was counted. Yet morale held, not from abundance, but from faith. Many believed that the city, built upon such heights, could never be taken. Across the river, Wolfe grew restless. He was not a man suited to long sieges. His nature demanded movement, action, risk. But Quebec would not yield to mere patience. The walls stood firm, and the French refused to come out and fight. So, Wolfe tried something else, to make the city suffer enough that Montcalm would be forced into the open. On the night of July 12th, British mortars opened fire from Point Lévis. The shells arced high across the river, glowing faintly as they rose, then fell upon the city with dull, concussive flashes. Roofs caught fire, the streets filled with smoke and sparks. The bombardment continued for weeks, day after day, until nearly every house within the upper town bore scars of stone and flame. Still, Quebec endured. Its people grew thin, their spirits weary, but the French flag continued to fly above the citadel. Wolfe's frustration deepened. He ordered new landings along the north shore, trying to find a foothold closer to the city. At Montmorency Falls, his troops clashed with French forces entrenched behind thick brush and earthworks. The battle was short but fierce. British soldiers slipped on the wet ground, their muskets misfiring in the rain. The French held firm. By evening, Wolfe called the retreat, leaving hundreds dead or wounded. The Montmorency defeat shook the army's confidence. For the first time, some officers whispered that Quebec might be impossible to take. The French seemed to hold every advantage: the high ground, the defensive lines, the support of local militia who knew every path through the forests. In his tent that night, Wolfe sat alone, writing by the light of a single candle. His letter to Pitt was both honest and heavy. "My antagonist has wisely shut himself up in his entrenchments and will not fight me. I cannot persuade him out, and I fear this campaign may prove fruitless." Yet he would not give up. Through August, the siege continued, a strange mixture of violence and monotony. The British cannon thundered daily, but their impact diminished as powder and shot ran low. Men spent hours repairing entrenchments, carrying water, or simply waiting. The heat was oppressive. The air smelled of tar and gunpowder. At night, the soldiers could hear faint sounds drifting across the river: church bells, distant songs, dogs barking within the city. Sometimes, during quiet hours, men from both sides shouted across the water. Not insults, but small exchanges, questions about home, the weather, even offers to trade tobacco. War, in its pauses, allowed humanity to breathe again. As August dragged on, Wolfe's health began to fail. He suffered from fever and dysentery, and the endless tension wore him thin. His officers worried. Some thought he might not survive the campaign. But even in illness, his mind remained fixed on the problem of Quebec. He began to consider new approaches, desperate, unconventional ideas. One proposal involved landing troops far upriver, beyond the city's main defences, and scaling the cliffs under cover of night. It was risky, perhaps impossible, but the alternative was worse: withdrawal. Montcalm, for his part, was not blind to the strain within the British camp. He too was tired. His letters to superiors in Montreal spoke of exhaustion and doubt, yet he held his position, convinced that time was his greatest ally. Autumn would soon arrive, and with it, the cold. The British fleet could not remain forever. When winter came, the ice would close the river, and Wolfe's army would be forced to withdraw or perish. By early September, the stalemate had stretched for nearly 3 months. The soldiers of both sides had settled into a grim rhythm. The morning watch, the evening gunfire, the ceaseless work. The fields between the river and the city were scarred with trenches and burnt trees. Each day seemed the same as the one before, and yet, beneath that sameness, change was gathering, quietly, invisibly. Wolfe's commanders, men like Monckton, Townshend and Murray, were meeting in secrecy, discussing one final attempt to break the deadlock. Wolfe himself, though weak, had made his decision. The time for waiting was over. If Quebec would not fall by siege, it would be taken by surprise. In his last letter home before the assault, he wrote, "My constitution is entirely shattered, without the consolation of having done any considerable service to the state, and indeed without any prospect of it. Yet within days, that prospect would appear, a plan born not from confidence but from necessity." As September's wines began to turn colder and the leaves along the river took on their autumn hue, the stalemate that had defined the summer was finally about to break. The question that lingered, quietly, even among those who did not speak it, was simple and terrible. Would Wolfe's final gamble bring glory to Britain, or ruin to all who followed him up the cliffs? By the second week of September 1759, the St. Lawrence River had turned grey beneath the shifting autumn sky. The wind carried a chill that hinted at winter's approach. For the British Army camped below Quebec, that change in weather was both warning and deadline. If the city did not fall soon, the campaign would fail. General James Wolfe knew it. His officers knew it. Even the common soldiers, weary from months of labour and illness, could feel the quiet urgency in every order. The siege had reached its final moment. Wolfe, thin and pale from sickness, moved among his men with a calm that masked exhaustion. He had made his decision, one last attempt to take Quebec. It would not be a frontal assault, nor another bombardment. Instead, he would attempt what most thought impossible: to climb the cliffs west of the city, under cover of darkness, and surprise the French army on the Heights of Abraham. It was a plan born of desperation, but also of calculation. Wolfe had studied the terrain for weeks, sending scouts and small boats upriver to find a point where the cliffs could be scaled. At last, they had found one. A narrow cove called L'Anse-au-Foulon, where a small path wound upward through brush and rock. French guards watched the spot, but only lightly. It seemed too steep for an army to climb. That, Wolfe decided, would be his road to victory. On the evening of September 12th, as dusk settled over the river, the British fleet began to move. The tide was high, the moon faint behind clouds, perfect conditions for concealment. Orders were whispered, not shouted. Muskets were wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound. The oars of the longboats were padded with leather. Wolfe, sitting upright in one of the first boats, looked ahead toward the dark line of shore. Around him, hundreds of men, grenadiers, light infantry, and regulars, waited in silence. The only sound was the steady rhythm of oars dipping into water. To keep the illusion intact, Admiral Saunders had ordered other ships downstream to make noise and feint attacks near Montcalm's main lines, drawing French attention away from the true landing. The deception worked. Montcalm, hearing the cannon to the east, assumed Wolfe was preparing another failed assault near Montmorency. Upstream, the small boats drifted quietly with the current. As they neared the cliffs, the British encountered a French sentry post. A voice called out in the darkness, a challenge in French. For a moment, time froze. Then one of Wolfe's officers, fluent in the language, replied confidently that they were a supply convoy bringing provisions. The ruse held. The sentries allowed them to pass. When the boats reached the narrow beach, the soldiers disembarked quickly and began the ascent. The path was little more than a goat trail, steep and slick with dew. Men climbed on hands and knees, pulling themselves upward by roots and rocks. Muskets clattered, packs slipped. But they kept moving, silent, determined, ghost-like against the cliff face. At the top, a handful of French guards fired a few shots before being overwhelmed. By dawn, Wolfe's first regiment stood upon the plateau. Cold, breathless, and stunned at their own success. More men followed, hauling light artillery and ammunition up the slope. When the morning mist lifted, the city of Quebec lay less than a mile away. Wolfe had done the impossible. His army now stood on open ground above the city, where Montcalm had never expected them. Montcalm, at first, refused to believe the reports. His officers insisted the British were on the heights, but he thought it a diversion. When he finally rode out and saw the red-coated lines forming across the fields, his heart sank. He had been outmaneuvered, yet he would not retreat. There was no time to call reinforcements from the surrounding camps. The British position had to be challenged immediately before they could entrench or bring up their heavy guns. Montcalm gathered roughly 4,000 men, regulars, militia, and indigenous allies, and marched toward the heights. The two armies faced each other across a stretch of open farmland just beyond the city walls. The ground was uneven, dotted with fences and bushes. The morning sun glinted faintly on the barrels of muskets and bayonets. Wolfe placed his troops in two long lines, about 1,000 yards from Quebec's walls. He ordered them to stand silent, hold their fire, and wait until the French were within 40 yards. It was discipline against momentum, patience against haste. At about 10 in the morning, Montcalm's troops advanced, their line uneven, muskets flashing in scattered volleys. The British did not move. The French came closer, shouting, "Vive le roi!" as they fired again. Still, the British line stood firm, red ranks unmoving, smoke drifting between them. Then, at Wolfe's signal, the entire front fired a single devastating volley. 2,000 muskets at once. The French line wavered. A second volley followed, and another. Within minutes, their attack dissolved into confusion. Men fell in clusters, and the rest began to retreat toward the city. Wolfe, leading from the front, was struck twice, first in the wrist, then in the stomach. He fell to the ground but refused to be carried off. As his officers knelt beside him, he asked how the battle went. When told that the French were in retreat, he murmured, "Then I die content." Moments later, he was gone. On the opposite side of the field, Montcalm was also struck by a musket ball while trying to rally his men. He was carried into the city, where he died the next morning. When told he would not live to see another sunrise, he whispered, "So much the better. I shall not live to see Quebec surrender." By afternoon, the British flag flew over the heights of Abraham. The French army had withdrawn across the river to the south, leaving the city vulnerable. On September 18, 1759, Quebec formally surrendered to the British. The victory was decisive, but costly. Nearly 600 men had fallen, including both commanding generals. Two adversaries who had shared in death the strange equality that war sometimes grants. In the silence that followed the battle, the fields of the heights were littered with broken muskets, torn uniforms, and the scattered papers of two armies. The wind moved softly over them, carrying the faint scent of gunpowder and the slow tolling of church bells from the battered city. To the men who survived, the day felt both triumphant and hollow. The war was not yet over. Montreal remained, and so did French ambitions elsewhere, but the outcome had shifted. The balance of empires had changed on a single morning's gamble, and as dusk settled again over the cliffs, one could almost imagine Wolfgang's final words carried by the river's cold breath, a reminder of how fragile victory truly is. History would remember this day as one of Britain's greatest triumphs. But to those who stood upon the heights, staring at the quiet city below, another question lingered. Now that the great fortress had fallen, what would come next? The battle was over, but peace did not follow. When the smoke cleared from the heights of Abraham and the cannons fell silent, Quebec stood broken, not conquered in spirit, but hollowed by exhaustion. The air that autumn was cold, carrying the scent of charred wood and wet earth. On September 18th, 1759, the white flag of surrender was raised above Quebec's battered walls. British troops entered the city in orderly ranks, their boots echoing on the cobbled streets. Behind them followed silence, the kind that comes after too much noise. Inside Quebec, The faces that watched from doorways were pale and guarded. Women, children, priests, and wounded soldiers stood among ruins. Roofs were shattered, walls cracked, and churches scarred by months of bombardment. The once proud capital of New France had become a husk, still standing, but stripped of confidence. General George Townshend, who had assumed command after Wolfe's death, signed the formal terms of capitulation. The French garrison, allowed to march out with honours, laid down their arms and withdrew under safe conduct. But many of the city's inhabitants stayed behind. This was their home, their world, and they did not yet understand what it meant to live under the flag of their enemy. That autumn, the British settled into the uneasy role of occupiers. They repaired what they could: the fortifications, the hospitals, the storehouses. They cleared rubble from the streets and buried the dead in shallow graves outside the walls. The soldiers who had fought and bled for the city now slept in damp, makeshift quarters. The air was always cold, the wind seeping through gaps in the walls. Letters sent back to London spoke of triumph, but life on the ground was far from glorious. The siege had destroyed food stores, and supply ships could not always make the dangerous journey up the St. Lawrence. By November, snow began to fall, and the river froze. Quebec was cut off, surrounded by ice, distant from both France and Britain. It was the winter of occupation, and for those trapped inside, survival became the only campaign left to fight. The soldiers rationed what little provisions remained: salted beef, hard biscuit, and whatever root vegetables could be scavenged. Scurvy returned, that ancient sailor's disease that made gums bleed and limbs ache. Entire companies weakened. The sick were carried to the monastery hospitals, where British surgeons worked beside French nuns in an unlikely truce of necessity. The French civilians fared no better. Many had lost everything during the siege. Their grain stores were gone, their livestock dead or stolen. Families burned furniture for warmth. Some begged rations from the British garrison. Others retreated into silence and prayer, trusting that spring would bring deliverance. Perhaps the return of the French army, perhaps the end of all suffering. Yet even amid hardship, the rhythm of daily life continued. In the narrow streets, British sentries stood guard while children crept past them to fetch water from the frozen wells. The cathedral bells still rang for Mass, though fewer attended. Priests spoke carefully in their sermons, choosing words that would not anger the new masters. Relations between conqueror and conquered were delicate. Some officers treated the French with respect, mindful that peace required restraint. Others were less patient, suspicious of the locals and quick to punish imagined defiance. Most of the time, though, fatigue dulled all tempers. Men who had survived the horrors of siege and battle now faced the duller misery of cold and hunger. Townshend, anxious to maintain order, issued strict regulations: no looting, no harassment of civilians, no disorderly conduct. But enforcement was imperfect. Winter blurred all distinctions. French and British alike were reduced to endurance. For the officers, evenings were spent around smoky hearths, reading by candlelight or writing letters home. Some kept journals, quiet records of isolation. One captain described looking out across the frozen river, a world locked in white silence, the air so cold it burns to breathe. Another wrote of the strange peace that followed conquest. We have won a city, yet it feels as though the world itself has been lost in the snow. Meanwhile, in the forests south of the river, the remnants of the French army gathered under François de Lévis, Montcalm's second-in-command. He was determined to retake Quebec come spring. His men, French regulars, Canadian militia, and indigenous allies, spent the winter rebuilding their strength near Montreal. They knew the British were weak, their numbers thinned by disease and cold. When the thaw came, Lévis would strike. In the city, rumours of this counterattack circulated like whispers carried on the wind. British officers dismissed them publicly, but privately they worried. They had only a few thousand men to defend a ruined city. Reinforcements would not arrive until the river thawed. By February, the temperature dropped so low that even the gunmetal froze to the touch. The sound of musket fire echoed differently in the cold, sharp, distant, as if the air itself resisted it. Wolves came down from the hills at night, drawn by the smell of refuse and the weakness of men. And yet, amid all this, the two sides, the defeated and the victors, shared a strange, reluctant coexistence. British soldiers bought bread from French bakers, traded tobacco for candles, and sometimes shared drink in the flickering warmth of a tavern. The war, for a time, seemed to have paused. When March came, the ice began to crack. The river shifted with groans like distant thunder. The first gulls returned, circling above the battered towers of Quebec. To the weary garrison, it was a sound of hope, but also warning. They knew what spring would bring. Lévis was preparing to march. As April neared, the snow melted into mud, and the roads outside the city turned to rivers of slush. In the distance, scouts reported movement, columns of French troops advancing from the west. The long winter was ending, but the war was not. Inside Quebec, men cleaned their muskets and patched their uniforms, too tired to feel fear. Officers looked to the south, toward the horizon, wondering whether they would live to see another summer. The British had endured the winter, but endurance, as history often reminds us, is not the same as safety. And so, as the ice broke and the current began to move again, one quiet question hung over the city's frozen rooftops. Would Quebec's hard-won victory survive the coming thaw, or be washed away with the melting snow? When the river thawed and the first mist of spring rose above the St. Lawrence, the silence of winter broke, replaced by the sound of drums, hooves, and marching feet. In April of 1760, the French came back. General François de Lévis, calm, sharp, and unyielding, led what remained of the army of New France. He had spent the long winter gathering strength, recruiting Canadian militia, rallying indigenous allies, and coaxing discipline from the remnants of shattered regiments. His men were worn, their uniforms patched and weapons rusted, but their spirits burned with one single purpose: retake Quebec. To them, the city was not just a fortress. It was the heart of New France, the last symbol of their world before it slipped into British hands. By early April, Lévis had assembled around 7,000 men at Montreal. They began their march eastward through the melting forests and muddy roads. The thaw made every mile a trial. Boots sank deep into the muck, wagons broke their wheels, and swollen rivers forced endless detours. But they pressed on, driven by the hope that the British, weak and starving from their winter of isolation, could be beaten. Inside Quebec, the British garrison had dwindled to roughly 4,000 men, many sick, many underfed. General James Murray, now commander of the city, had done what he could through the winter, but his soldiers were gaunt, their uniforms ragged, their morale uncertain. Supplies were nearly gone, and the hospitals overflowed with frostbitten and scurvy-stricken men. Still, Murray was no coward. He knew Lévis would come, and he meant to meet him not behind walls, but on open ground. At dawn on April 28, 1760, the two armies collided outside the city at a small plateau west of Quebec known as Sainte-Foy. The morning was cold and wet, the ground still soft from melting snow. The British marched out first, drums steady, red coats gleaming faintly beneath grey clouds. Murray positioned his men in lines along the ridge, overlooking the plain. He hoped to strike first, to break Lévis before the French could deploy. But the French knew the land better. Lévis advanced carefully, using the woods for cover. His troops emerged in disciplined ranks, blue coats, white crossbelts, bayonets glittering. The cannon fire began with a thunderous crack that echoed across the frozen fields. For hours, the battle swayed back and forth like a pendulum. The British cannon tore gaps in the French lines, but Lévis pressed on, steady as the tide. French sharpshooters picked off officers. Militia fired from behind fences and thickets. Smoke rolled low over the field, thick with the smell of sulphur and wet earth. Murray tried to rally his men, his voice hoarse, his sword raised. They fought with fierce discipline, but fatigue and numbers turned against them. The French artillery found its range, pounding the British flanks. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the red lines began to buckle. By mid-afternoon, Murray ordered a retreat toward Quebec. The withdrawal turned desperate as the French pressed close. Muskets flashed, bayonets clashed, and men stumbled over corpses in the mud. When the firing finally ceased, Sainte-Foy was a field of ruin. Over 1,100 British soldiers lay dead or wounded, another 800 captured. The French losses were nearly as heavy, but they held the field. It was, by every measure, a French victory. Lévis had reclaimed the ground Wolfe had won, and for a brief moment, it seemed Quebec might yet return to French hands. The battered survivors of Murray's force retreated behind the city's walls, closing the gates once more. Lévis moved his army forward, setting up siege lines where Wolfe's had stood the year before. His men dug trenches, hauled cannon into place, and prepared to shell Quebec into submission. Inside the city, conditions were dire. The British had little powder left, fewer rations, and almost no reinforcements. Their ships, their lifeline to the outside world, had not yet arrived. The St. Lawrence was only just beginning to clear of ice, and the first sails on the horizon could belong to either side. For days, both armies waited in tense expectation. The French needed their own fleet, a squadron from France that had promised to sail that spring. Lévis was confident it would come. Without it, his siege could not last. Then, on May 9th, sails appeared on the river. Men on both sides rushed to the ramparts, shading their eyes against the glare. 3 ships rounded the bend, flags snapping in the wind. For a breathless moment, no one could tell whose they were. And then, the red ensign of Britain unfurled. Cheers erupted from the city walls. The British fleet had arrived first. Lévis, watching from his lines, understood at once what it meant. Without naval support, his siege was doomed. Within hours, British guns opened fire again, this time from the river. The French positions were pounded, their trenches shattered. That night, under cover of darkness, Lévis ordered a retreat. The French slipped away into the forests, leaving their wounded behind. The next morning, the plain of Sainte-Foy lay silent once more, strewn with cannon, broken muskets, and the bodies of men from both sides. The counterattack had failed. Quebec remained in British hands. Lévis withdrew west toward Montreal, his army exhausted, his supplies gone. He would fight again, but in his heart, he knew the tide had turned. France's grip on North America was slipping, not from cowardice or defeat in battle, but from the slow, steady loss of a continent too vast to hold. Back in Quebec, Murray's men repaired their defences and buried their dead. The spring sun shone weakly on the battlefield, melting the last of the snow into pools of red and brown. The war for Quebec was over, but the war for New France was not. The final act was yet to come, a march toward Montreal and the quiet end of an empire. By the summer of 1760, the long shadow of defeat had fallen across New France. The forests that once seemed endless now felt like walls closing in. The rivers that had carried trade and life for generations became escape routes, winding toward a single and inevitable end, Montreal. It was here that the last governor of New France, Pierre de Vaudreuil, made his stand. After Lévis' failed siege of Quebec, the French army retreated westward in slow, painful stages. They carried what they could, tattered flags, wounded comrades, worn muskets, through towns that no longer cheered their passing. Villages once bustling with traders and soldiers now stood half empty, their people uncertain whether to stay or flee. Supplies were gone. Gunpowder was scarce. Even food had become a luxury. Still, the French commanders refused to surrender. They believed one more campaign might turn the tide, if only reinforcements from France could arrive. But across the Atlantic, France was already consumed by its own struggles. Its navy had been shattered, its colonies lost one by one. No help would come. Meanwhile, the British were closing in from every direction. From the north, General James Murray, fresh from his defence of Quebec, began marching upriver with a hardened force of around 4,000 men. From the south, Another British army under General Geoffrey Amherst advanced from New York, methodically capturing French forts along Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River, and from the west, William Haviland moved east from Lake Ontario, driving through the wilderness, taking post after post with little resistance. 3 British armies, more than 17,000 men in total, converging on one final point. Montreal, the heart of French Canada, now stood alone. By late August, Vaudreuil could see the writing on the wall. The French army, reduced to barely 2,000 regulars and a few thousand militia and indigenous allies, had little powder left and almost no provisions. Lévis, still loyal and defiant, wanted to fight, to defend Montreal to the last, even if it meant the city's destruction. But Vaudreuil hesitated. He knew that to fight would mean not only military defeat, but the ruin of thousands of civilians, the women, children, and old men who now crowded the narrow streets and riverfront homes. For days, debates raged in the governor's council. Should they surrender and preserve life, or resist and preserve honor? As they argued, the sound of British drums grew closer. By September 6th, Murray's force appeared on the north shore of the island. Amherst's troops advanced from the south, crossing the last remaining rivers. By the evening of September 7th, British soldiers surrounded Montreal from all sides. There was no escape, no fleet, no hope. Inside the city, the people waited in silence. The church bells that had once rung for festivals now tolled only for funerals. Priests walked the streets offering last blessings, while merchants boarded up their shops. The St. Lawrence, once alive with French sails, lay empty beneath the fading light. On the morning of September 8th, 1760, Governor Vaudreuil sent a messenger under a white flag to General Amherst. He requested terms of surrender, not for himself, but for all of Canada. Amherst received him coolly. He had strict orders from London, no leniency, no special privileges. Yet he understood the gravity of the moment. Amherst's reply was formal, cold, and final. All French troops would lay down their arms. Civilians would be protected, property respected, and those who wished could return to France. That afternoon, the two commanders met to sign the Articles of Capitulation of Montreal. In a quiet room overlooking the river, with maps spread across a wooden table, the last chapter of New France was written. The document contained 55 articles, detailing everything from the rights of priests and nuns to the treatment of indigenous allies. Lévis, though bitter, refused to sign. He could not bring himself to surrender men who had fought so bravely. But Vaudreuil, his face pale and eyes hollow, took the quill. When his name was inked, the French flag that had flown over Canada for more than 150 years came down. The British marched into Montreal in solemn silence. There was no cheer, no triumphal parade. The streets were lined with weary citizens, women clutching children, old soldiers saluting as the red-coated regiments passed by. Amherst rode at the head of the column, impassive, his orders fulfilled. The Union Jack rose above the city. For the first time in history, the entirety of Canada belonged to Britain. Far from the city, in the forests and along the rivers, the news spread slowly, to trappers, to farmers, to the scattered indigenous nations who had fought beside the French. Some refused to believe it. Others understood too well what it meant. In the space of one generation, the world had changed. The French Empire in North America was gone, erased not by a single battle, but by exhaustion, distance, and time. The surviving French officers began preparations to return home. Ships would come in the following spring to take them back to Europe. Many never made the journey, their names lost in parish records, their graves unmarked. As autumn settled over the St. Lawrence Valley, the leaves turned gold, then brown, then fell into the river's current, drifting toward the sea, like the empire that once claimed those waters. The British soldiers built winter quarters in Montreal and Quebec. They repaired roads, wrote letters home, and wondered what peace might look like in this new land. Few yet understood that this conquest, so costly and vast, was only the beginning of another struggle, a quieter, more subtle war of empire, identity, and governance. New France was gone, but the people remained, and in their language, in their faith, and in the rhythms of life along the river, something French would continue to endure. The British commanders knew the military campaign was over, yet, as snow began to fall again that year, new orders arrived from London, plans not for peace, but for the management of empire. How would Britain rule this vast, alien land? Its language strange, its faith different, its loyalties uncertain. That question would trouble ministers and governors for years to come. When the guns finally fell silent in North America, another kind of battle began, one of paper, policy, and patience. The British Empire had won a continent, but no one seemed entirely sure what to do with it. From the fortress of Quebec to the bustling docks of Montreal, the Union Jack fluttered above a land still deeply French, in its language, its laws, its religion, and its rhythms of daily life. The officers who had fought so hard to take it now found themselves in an unfamiliar role, administrators of a conquered people. And for many of them, this was far more exhausting than war. In London, victory was celebrated with fireworks and praise for William Pitt, now hailed as the architect of Britain's success. But the joy of conquest faded quickly when the bills began to arrive. The 7 Years' War had cost Britain more than 160 million, an unimaginable sum. The Treasury groaned under the weight of debt, and the politicians who had demanded victory now demanded payment. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the practical cost of maintaining this new empire was only beginning to unfold. The British soldiers garrisoned in Quebec and Montreal soon discovered the difficulties of occupation. Supplies were short, the climate harsh, and relations with the French inhabitants uncertain. Many officers had expected rebellion or resistance. Instead, they found resignation and silence. Governor James Murray, appointed as the first British governor of Quebec, tried to govern with moderation. He understood that to rule effectively, he had to respect the people's customs. "They are," he wrote, "a brave and faithful race, but attached to their own laws and religion." He permitted Catholic priests to continue their work and allowed French civil law to remain in practice for local matters. To London, this leniency seemed suspicious. Some accused Murray of being too French, too sympathetic to the conquered. But on the ground, it was a matter of survival. There were simply too few British settlers, too few officials, to impose a new order by force. And so, for a time, Quebec existed in a quiet, uneasy limbo, neither fully British nor entirely French. Meanwhile, in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley, another challenge emerged. The indigenous nations who had fought alongside the French now faced a new and unfamiliar power. The British, less generous in trade and less respectful in diplomacy, replaced the gift-giving alliances that had long bound the French and native peoples together with rules and orders. To them, this was not conquest, it was betrayal. The great Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa would soon rise in defiance, but in these first years, his anger simmered quietly beneath the surface. British garrisons held the old French forts, Detroit, Michilimackinac, Niagara, but their walls felt fragile in the vast wilderness. Supplies travelled slowly, discipline wore thin, and soldiers wrote letters home describing isolation and unease. Back in London, ministers debated endlessly over how to govern their new North American empire. There were practical questions: how to collect taxes, how to manage trade. But there were also deeper, more philosophical ones. Could two peoples, so different in language and faith, live under one crown? And even beyond Quebec, Britain now found itself responsible for vast new territories. In the Caribbean, in India, in West Africa. Each victory brought new complications. In the West Indies, sugar planters demanded troops to protect their slaves and estates. In India, the East India Company, fresh from its triumph at Plassey, sought official sanction for its growing dominion. And in North America, the colonies along the Atlantic coast, Massachusetts, Virginia, Pennsylvania, began to ask their own troubling question. If Britain can govern Frenchmen without their consent, What might she demand next from us? For now, those whispers went largely unheard. In the newly conquered province, life settled into a rhythm of cautious coexistence. French farmers returned to their fields, priests reopened schools, and British officers learned to endure the long winters. Trade resumed along the St. Lawrence, though now under new regulations. The great fur companies adapted, their ledgers soon written in both English and French hands. But beneath the surface calm, both conqueror and conquered felt a quiet unease. The French habitants, the peasants of the countryside, paid their tithes, spoke their language, and lived by the old rhythms of the church. They prayed for peace, but they also wondered if the King of France would ever return. Some even refused to swear loyalty to the British crown, preferring to live in ambiguity rather than allegiance. The British soldiers, meanwhile, began to feel trapped in a cold, distant world that seemed to forget them. Many were discharged and left to wander, seeking passage home. Others stayed, marrying local women and planting roots in the soil they had once marched to conquer. As the years passed, reports flowed back to London of minor disputes, small uprisings, and endless expenses. Each dispatch reminded Parliament that empire, glorious in victory, was heavy in maintenance. By 1763, as diplomats gathered in Europe to draft the peace that would officially end the war, the sense of triumph had already dimmed. Britain had gained an empire, vast, diverse, and costly. But it had also inherited the burdens of governance, diplomacy, and debt. When the Treaty of Paris was signed that February, the final lines were clear and simple. France ceded Canada to Britain. Spain gained Louisiana. And across the Atlantic, a new map of power emerged, one that tilted unmistakably in Britain's favour. Yet even in triumph, there was unease. William Pitt, the man who had once envisioned empire as Britain's destiny, warned that this victory might bring more trouble than glory. The colonies, he said, will not always bear the hand that governs them. For now, though, Britain rejoiced. Bells rang, newspapers celebrated, and merchants dreamed of new fortunes in trade. But in the quiet rooms of government, others began to ask, how do you pay for an empire this large? And who, in the end, would bear the cost? When the delegates gathered in Paris in the winter of 1763, the war that had engulfed nearly every great power in Europe was finally drawing to an end. For 7 long years, battles had burned from the plains of Germany to the jungles of India, from the Caribbean islands to the frozen woods of Canada. The 7 years. War had reshaped the map of the world, and it had also reshaped how nations thought about power itself. Now at last, it was time to put the chaos into words. The negotiations that led to the Treaty of Paris were not scenes of celebration or triumph. They were quiet, formal, and weary. The diplomats who gathered, British, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, spoke in measured tones, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. Every clause, every comma, carried the weight of empires. For Britain, victory had been vast. They had seized control of Canada, Florida, and several key Caribbean islands. Their navy ruled the seas, their armies stood in India, and their trade stretched across every ocean. But these gains came at a cost, the kind of cost that could not be seen on a map. The empire was richer in land, poorer in coin, and already restless with new responsibilities. For France, the defeat was total, but not quite ruinous. Though she had lost Canada and her foothold in India, France's negotiators, led by the skillful Duc de Choiseul, managed to retain what truly mattered to the crown: the sugar islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique. These small tropical possessions, no bigger than a few English counties, produced sugar so valuable that they were worth more in revenue than all of cold, distant Canada. It was a bitter trade, empire for economy, but it reflected a pragmatic truth. Empires are not built only on pride, but on profit. Spain, too, emerged changed. Drawn into the war late, she had lost Florida to Britain, but gained Louisiana from France, a vast territory stretching from the Mississippi to the Rockies. Few in Madrid truly understood what they had inherited. Fewer still could imagine that one day, This transfer would shape the destiny of another rising nation yet unborn. And so, on February 10th, 1763, the treaty was signed. The ink dried on parchment that would, for generations, define the modern world. For Britain, the announcement was met with celebration. Church bells rang across London. Newspapers proclaimed an empire of continents. But behind the rejoicing, a quieter, more complicated truth began to settle in. Victory had made Britain the most powerful empire on earth, yet it also made her more vulnerable than ever. She now governed millions of new subjects, French-speaking Canadians, Spanish Floridians, and countless indigenous nations who had not been consulted in any treaty. The British Crown had extended its reach so far that it could barely feel the ends of its own fingers. In the American colonies, the reaction was mixed. Colonists in Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston celebrated the end of the French threat. They saw in Britain's triumph the promise of safety, expansion, and trade. Yet, beneath the toasts and bonfires, something else began to stir. An awareness that the war had been fought and paid for largely by them, and that the fruits of victory were being claimed elsewhere. When London began to hint that the colonies might need to help pay for the cost of the war, through new taxes, duties, and restrictions, resentment took root. It was still faint then, no louder than a murmur. But history has a way of amplifying whispers. Meanwhile, in France, the mood was grim but not despairing. Intellectuals and ministers alike reflected on the loss of empire as a kind of renewal. The philosopher Voltaire, ever biting in his wit, famously dismissed Canada as a few acres of snow. To him, the loss of distant wilderness was no tragedy. It was an opportunity to focus France's power on Europe, on art, on philosophy, on the refinement of civilization. But for the sailors of Brest, for the soldiers of the Navy who had fought across oceans, it felt like the end of something vast and irreplaceable. In the Caribbean, where the sugar trade continued to flow, planters raised their glasses to fortune. On the docks of Halifax, British ships unloaded their cannon and returned to quieter duties. In Montreal, the French flag had long been lowered, yet the people still spoke the same language, kept the same faith, and tilled the same frozen fields. Empires may change names, but people remain. And across the ocean, in the corridors of London's government, clerks began their endless work, cataloguing lands, redrawing borders, and drafting proclamations. Among those papers, one in particular would soon emerge, a royal directive to organize Britain's new North American empire and to keep peace with the native nations who still dominated its interior. It would be called the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and though intended as a measure of order, it would become a spark of resentment that burned across the colonies. But that is the story of what came after the peace, when victory began to turn uneasy, and the first seeds of discontent were sown. For now, the diplomats of Paris had done their work. They had divided continents, rebalanced powers, and drawn lines on maps that would outlive them all. In the great salons of Europe, candles flickered over the treaty's parchment. The wax seals cooled. The signatures faded slowly with time. But the world that emerged from that winter of 1763, larger, richer, and more fragile, was not one of rest. It was one of transition, because no empire remains still for long, and even in the calm that follows victory, the currents of change are already moving beneath the surface. Quiet, steady, and unstoppable. Peace, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. After so many years of thunder and gunfire, the stillness of 1763 felt almost unnatural, a kind of silence that hummed beneath the surface, heavy with unfinished business. Britain had won the war. The world had been redrawn in her favor. But as soldiers returned home and the cannons cooled, another sound began to grow in the distance. The slow, insistent scratching of pens against paper as clerks tallied the cost. The 7 Years' War had been the most expensive conflict in British history. The final bill came to more than £160 million, a figure so vast that even the most seasoned ministers struggled to comprehend it. The empire's credit was strained to its limits. Interest payments alone consume more than half of the government's annual revenue. Victory, it turned out, was not cheap. And though Britain's red lines stretched across the world map, the question that haunted Parliament was simple: who will pay for it? In London, ministers debated late into the night. The logic was cold but clear. The colonies had gained the most from Britain's victory, and so the colonies must help pay for it. The war had secured their frontiers, removed the French threat, and opened the continent to new settlement. Surely they could contribute a small share. But across the Atlantic, the colonies saw things differently. They believed they had already paid, in blood, in supplies, in years of fear and hardship. Many colonial assemblies had taxed themselves heavily to raise militias, build roads, and feed soldiers. To them, the idea of paying even more after peace had already been won felt unjust. Still, in 1763, those arguments had yet to ignite. For now, the empire was more focused on order than rebellion. The immediate challenge lay not in London or Boston, but deep within the forests and rivers of the continent itself, in the territories that had once belonged to France. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, issued that October, was meant to bring structure to Britain's vast new dominion. It drew a long, invisible line down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, declaring that no colonial settlers were to move west beyond it. The land beyond, stretching across the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes, and toward the Mississippi, was to remain reserved for the indigenous nations. To the British government, it was a practical measure, a way to prevent further wars, to honour treaties, and to organise trade. But to the settlers, veterans, and land speculators of the colonies, it felt like a betrayal. They had fought and bled for that land, and now, by a royal decree, it was forbidden to them. In taverns from Virginia to Pennsylvania, men muttered darkly about the King's line. And in the West, among the native nations, anger had already begun to smoulder. The British, unlike the French, had little interest in ceremony or gift-giving. They enforced trade restrictions, treated tribal envoys with cold authority, and occupied the old French forts with arrogance. The great Ottawa leader Pontiac, who had once fought alongside the French, now gathered his followers in secret councils. His message was simple: the British have come not as allies, but as masters. By the spring of 1763, those words became action. Fort after fort across the frontier came under siege: Detroit, Sandusky, Michilimackinac. British traders were attacked, convoys ambushed, entire outposts burned to the ground. This uprising, known later as Pontiac's War, was brutal and unrelenting. Hundreds of settlers fled eastward, terrified by the scale of the violence. The British response was equally harsh. Scorched earth campaigns, retaliatory killings, and the grim logic of empire defending itself. In London, news of the rebellion arrived slowly, weeks after each disaster. To ministers already drowning in debt, it was infuriating. Had they not fought this entire war to bring peace and stability? Why then did the colonies seem to produce only more conflict? Each dispatch, each report, painted a picture of a vast empire fraying at the edges. Meanwhile, in Britain itself, life was not much easier. Taxes had risen sharply to pay for the debt. Bread prices climbed. Merchants complained of trade restrictions. Farmers grumbled about military levies. For the ordinary Briton, the empire's triumph felt distant, a costly dream that benefited others more than themselves. Yet amid all this discontent, the empire continued to expand its bureaucracy. Offices in Whitehall filled with clerks managing colonial accounts. Ships carried customs officials and surveyors across the Atlantic. New governors were appointed, new laws drafted. And always, the ledgers grew thicker, the numbers darker. The peace of 1763 had not brought relief. It had brought administration. And while Britain worked to impose order on its new empire, another kind of unease began to spread among its own officers and colonists in North America. They had fought side by side against the French, but now they looked at each other with suspicion. British regulars, proud of their discipline, regarded colonial militias as unruly and inferior. The colonists, in turn, saw the British soldiers as arrogant occupiers. Mutual respect, earned in battle, dissolved in peacetime. Letters from the colonies spoke of tension in the streets, of soldiers quartered in private homes, of resentment simmering just below the surface. The war had united them under one flag. Peace was beginning to divide them. And above it all loomed the great arithmetic of empire. The columns of debt, the mounting costs of garrisons, the endless petitions for funds. Every problem seemed to return to the same question: how to pay for what had been won. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, a new tax on colonial trade. It was modest by British standards, but in the colonies it was received with anger. Pamphlets appeared, merchants protested. For the first time, the word tyranny began to appear in print. No one in London took it seriously. Not yet. To them, it was simply noise, the usual colonial complaints. But in hindsight, that murmur marked the beginning of something larger, the first faint tremors of a conflict no one had foreseen. For Britain, peace had been meant as closure. Instead, it became the seedbed of discontent, a fragile calm that concealed deep and spreading cracks. The empire had conquered its enemies, but now it would have to reckon with itself. And across the ocean, in the quiet towns of New England and the growing ports of the South, people began to wonder, if this is what victory brings, debt, taxes and distance, what would defeat look like? The ink on the Treaty of Paris had barely dried when the next struggle for Britain's empire began. Not on the battlefield, but in the quiet chambers of Parliament and the crowded streets of its own colonies. The 7 Years' War had given Britain more land, more power, and more prestige than any European nation had ever possessed. But it had also left behind an invisible enemy: debt, resentment, and the growing realization that victory had tied the empire together in ways it could no longer easily manage. By 1765, the government faced a problem that could no longer be ignored. The cost of empire was eating itself alive. The army, which had once been stretched thin across Europe, now had to garrison a sprawling North American frontier, from Nova Scotia to Florida, and deep into the Great Lakes. 20 battalions were needed, perhaps more. The pay, the provisions, the fort repairs, all of it drained the treasury faster than it could recover. And so, ministers returned to the same question that had haunted them since the end of the war. Who should pay for Britain's new empire? The colonies, they decided, must. It was not, to them, a matter of punishment or exploitation, but of fairness. The British taxpayer, already burdened by years of wartime levies, could bear no more. The Americans, who had benefited most from the removal of the French threat, could surely contribute to their own defense. And thus came the law that would quietly shake the empire, the Stamp Act of 1765. On paper, it was a modest measure. Every newspaper, pamphlet, legal document, and playing card in the colonies was to bear an official stamped seal purchased from the Crown. The money raised would go directly toward maintaining British troops in America. It was, by all rational measure, a small tax, yet its symbolism cut deep. For the colonists, it was not about the amount, but the principle. They had no representatives in Parliament, no voice in how these laws were made, and yet they were being taxed as subjects. The phrase that would echo through history began to take shape in colonial taverns and assemblies. No taxation without representation. In London, this outcry was dismissed at first. To British ministers, the American colonies were not independent states, but dependencies of the Crown. They were represented virtually through Parliament's authority. The colonies' argument, they believed, was nothing more than unruly rhetoric, the kind of noise that could be silenced with patience and a few examples. But what began as murmurs of dissent soon swelled into open defiance. Throughout 1765, the colonies erupted. In Boston, crowds hanged effigies of tax collectors from trees. In New York, mobs tore down the home of the lieutenant governor. Across the seaboard, offices meant to distribute the stamped paper were destroyed before they could even open. What startled the British most was not the violence itself, but its organization. The colonies, so often divided by region, religion, and trade, had begun to speak with a shared voice. Representatives from 9 colonies gathered in New York that October for the Stamp Act Congress, drafting a formal declaration that the right to tax belonged solely to their own elected assemblies. In its tone, the declaration was polite, even deferential to the Crown, but its meaning was revolutionary. It was the first time the colonies had acted in concert against the authority of Parliament. The Stamp Act, meant to raise a few £1,000s, had awakened something far greater, a sense of common cause. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, ministers struggled to read the mood. Reports from governors were confusing. Some exaggerated the danger, others minimized it. Merchants in London and Bristol began to panic as American boycotts took hold, refusing to import British goods until the Act was repealed. Trade plummeted, and manufacturers petitioned Parliament in droves, begging for relief. Within a year, the government relented. In March 1766, under immense pressure, the Stamp Act was repealed. Bells rang out in the colonies. Crowds celebrated in the streets. Effigies were replaced by toasts to the king. For a moment, it seemed the empire might heal. But peace, once again, was deceptive. On the very same day that Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, it passed another, the Declaratory Act, affirming that Parliament had full power and authority to make laws and statutes to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. It was a quiet warning. The repeal had been an act of mercy, not of concession. To the colonists, the words "in all cases whatsoever" carried the chill of future conflict. They sensed the victory was temporary, that this question of authority had not been resolved, only postponed. In the wake of the Stamp Act crisis, the colonies found themselves changed. The idea of common resistance, once unthinkable, had proven possible. Committees of correspondence, organized boycotts, local assemblies, all these had grown out of the chaos and would soon become the machinery of something much larger. The seeds of rebellion had been planted, though no one yet recognized their full weight. In Britain, the government turned once more to new ideas for revenue. Charles Townshend, a brilliant but arrogant Chancellor of the Exchequer, believed he could succeed where others had failed. If direct taxes caused outrage, he reasoned, then indirect duties on imports might pass more quietly. And so, in 1767, the Townshend Acts were introduced, placing tariffs on glass, paper, lead, paint, and tea imported into the colonies. To Townshend, these were harmless commercial measures. To the colonies, they were proof that Parliament still sought to tax them without consent. Protests resumed, boycotts spread, and pamphlets circulated in every port. The colonies were learning with surprising speed how to resist not through arms, but through unity. And all the while, beneath these acts and counteracts, something deeper was shifting. Colonial newspapers began printing essays about liberty and governance, quoting ancient philosophers and English constitutional law. Ordinary farmers and tradesmen debated rights that had once belonged only to scholars and politicians. British America was beginning to think of itself, not as a collection of provinces, but as a people. Across the sea, in the halls of Westminster, ministers dismissed these developments as temporary agitation, an overreaction by distant subjects. They could not yet see what was forming beneath the surface, the slow, inevitable drift of an empire dividing itself by principle. The war that had once united Britain and her colonies had built an empire too vast, too proud, and too costly to hold together with old traditions. And now, in the echo of its own triumph, that empire was beginning to crack. The question that would define the next decade hung quietly in the air, unspoken, but waiting. How long can loyalty survive when the cost of obedience feels greater than the reward of peace? The 7 Years' War had ended with Britain crowned the supreme power of the world, an empire stretching farther than any before it. Yet, scarcely a decade later, that same victory began to sound hollow. By 1767, the glow of triumph had faded into the grey routine of governance. The empire that had seemed united by conquest now strained under its own weight, held together by distance, debt, and doubt. In London, ministers debated endlessly over budgets and colonies. The Townshend Acts, passed only months before, were already causing unrest. Shipments of taxed goods sat unloaded in American ports, their crates quietly boycotted by colonial merchants. British manufacturers complained of empty orders, dock workers idled without wages, and shipowners cursed the quiet rebellion that rippled across the Atlantic. The victory that had once promised prosperity now brought only quarrels. In the American colonies, a quiet but powerful transformation was taking place. What had begun as anger over taxes had deepened into something more reflective, a rethinking of what it meant to belong to an empire. In Boston, printers like Samuel Adams and James Otis began filling newspapers with careful, deliberate arguments about rights and representation. They quoted John Locke and the Magna Carta, blending philosophy with everyday frustration. Pamphlets passed hand to hand, in taverns, churches, and meeting houses, whispering a shared suspicion that liberty, once surrendered, might never return. In New York, the British Army's presence grew heavier. Red-coated soldiers marched through narrow streets, enforcing order that no one had asked for. Their muskets and drums seemed to echo a warning that the peace won in 1763 was peace only for those willing to be silent. Ordinary citizens began to take sides. Shopkeepers refused British goods. Housewives brewed herbal teas in defiance of imported leaves. Printers set type in the dim light of candles, publishing essays that no one dared sign. To the officials in London, this defiance was petty, a passing storm of colonial vanity. They believed time and discipline would restore obedience. Few among them saw that the rebellion was not in arms, but in minds. Meanwhile, Britain itself was weary. The Empire's debts from the 7 Years' War had swollen to over 130 million, a staggering sum for the age. Interest payments devoured nearly half the nation's revenue. The people, tired of taxation and war, turned inward. Bread prices rose, riots flickered across industrial towns. And yet the Empire's ministers could not let go of their distant possessions. To lose control of the colonies, even through compromise, would be to admit that Britain's victory had not been mastery, but overreach. The historian might see irony here, that the triumph over France, achieved through coordination, unity, and immense sacrifice, would unravel because of the very qualities victory required. The war had taught the colonies to organize, to fight for their own defense, to see themselves as actors rather than subjects. When the danger passed, that spirit did not vanish, it waited. And in the wilderness that had once been France's domain, in Quebec, Montreal, and the forts along the Great Lakes, British officers discovered that peace with indigenous nations was far more complex than conquest. The Proclamation Line of 1763, meant to prevent settlers from crossing into the Ohio Valley, was ignored daily. Frontier farmers slipped past the boundary, cutting down forests, planting grain, and clashing with native confederacies still loyal to their own treaties. In these distant forests, the old world still lingered. French-speaking farmers in Quebec prayed in Latin under the same church steeples. British soldiers garrisoned in Fort Detroit played cards beside the same hearths that French traders once warmed their hands by. The map had changed, but the people, and their resentments, had not. Britain's empire was now global, but its unity was fragile. In India, the East India Company expanded ruthlessly, blending commerce with conquest. Governors in Calcutta ruled over millions, collecting revenue in the name of the crown but enriching private investors. It was a new kind of empire, less about faith or flag, more about finance. Yet even there, the ghost of the 7 Years' War lingered. The company's rise had been born of that same conflict, a victory over France that had opened the door to dominion. Across the seas, in London's coffee houses, talk of empire had lost its glamour. Where once men boasted of victories at Quebec or Minden, now they spoke of taxes, riots, and unrest. The word America, once a source of pride, now carried an edge of irritation, a reminder that power without harmony breeds unease. And yet, for all its troubles, Britain remained unmatched. Its navy commanded every ocean, its merchants filled every harbour, its influence reached from Bengal to Boston, from Jamaica to Gibraltar. The empire stood at its greatest height, and perhaps its most precarious. In 1768, Parliament sent more troops to Boston, believing that order could be restored by presence alone. It was a familiar logic, the same reasoning that had guided generals in Canada and India. But America was not a foreign frontier. These were British subjects, and every musket on their streets made the distance between them and London feel wider. By 1770, tensions had hardened. In March of that year, after months of insults, patrols, and provocations, British soldiers opened fire on a jeering crowd in Boston. 5 colonists were killed. The event would become known as the Boston Massacre, a small clash in numbers, yet immense in consequence. News spread across the colonies with the speed of rumour and print. What had begun years earlier as a protest over stamps and tea had now become something else entirely, a test of authority and of identity. The echoes of Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War still rang faintly, but now they were distorted, distant, melancholy. The triumph that had once united empire and colony had given birth to disillusion. The peace that was meant to last a century was already unravelling in the hands of a new generation. In hindsight, it is tempting to see inevitability in these years, as if empire was destined to fracture, as if history could only move in one direction. But for those living through it, merchants, soldiers, clerks, and farmers, it was not destiny, but confusion. They did not yet know that the old alliance between Britain and her colonies was ending. They only sensed that something enormous had shifted quietly beneath their feet. In London, the ministers still clung to reports from governors promising calm. In Boston, men whispered of liberty in candlelit rooms. And in Paris, old diplomats nodded knowingly. France had lost an empire, but Britain had gained a problem. As the decade closed, the world that had been remade in 1763 trembled once more. The empires of Europe had learned that victory is never final. It is merely the beginning of the next struggle. And somewhere, between the flicker of candlelight and the rustle of parchment maps, the echo of that truth lingered. That even the greatest triumphs carry within them the seeds of their undoing. That empires, like the men who build them, are only ever as stable as the peace they can hold, and that the war which had made Britain mighty, the 7 Years' War, had also set in motion the forces that would one day unmake her. And so, dear listener, the story closes, not with the roar of cannons, but with the soft hum of consequence. The world was changed, the maps redrawn, and history moved quietly forward, as it always does. If these calm wanderings through the past bring you peace or reflection, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. There are so many more quiet nights of history yet to share,